Kia ora. This session is looking at safety framework within schools and how it's structured and how it relates to the adventure activity regulations. So over on the right here, under the Health and Safety at Work Act, so schools obviously still have to abide by the Act, but the pathway down here is the one for the adventure regulations for the outdoor sector, and we've looked at that quite a bit already. This pathway on the other side here is just showing some equivalence to what is within the school framework. So in terms of the safety audit standard for adventure activities, the equivalent is EOTC guidelines, which are published by the Ministry of Education. The good practice guides are the good practice guides to go to for specific activities, and you find those on the Support Adventure website. And then there's a safety management plan and supporting documents set up specifically for schools as well. So this framework here, EOTC guidelines are developed by Ministry of Education and EONS together, and they're found on the Ministry of Education website, easily Googled to find it. It's also on Moodle. The good practice guides, as we looked at last session on the good practice session, was found on the Support Adventure website, and they're developed by sector groups facilitated by EONS, Education Outdoors New Zealand. And then the safety management plan and support documents for schools is again developed by, mostly facilitated by EONS and on the EONS website. So some more acronyms and some more key websites to go to. So we're already familiar with the Support Adventure website as a go-to for lots of good practice resources. We've got here's the link here to the Ministry of Education website where you have the EOTC guidelines, and then EONS, Education Outdoors New Zealand, which is kind of the professional body for EOTC teachers within the education sector. Really good website, EONS, with lots of key resources on there. So just reviewing some key health and safety at work Act principles. So the new term PCBUs, person conducting a business or undertaking, replaces employer, the term employer, and worker is a broad term that encompasses more than just an employee. And new duties, the PCBU has a primary duty of care, and the officer, so someone who has senior responsibility within the organisation, has a duty of due diligence. So within the school sector, PCBU is the Board of Trustees. They are the top of the hierarchy within a school as the Board of Trustees, and then an officer would be individual board members as well as the principal, because they all have senior leadership positions within a school. So the Board of Trustees and the principal as officers within an organisation like a school must exercise due diligence. This means that they must take positive steps to ensure the Board of Trustees meets its health and safety obligations. And then within the school context, a worker is anyone who works within the school, either voluntary or non-voluntary, so teachers, caretakers, contractors, volunteer workers, etc. And also includes other people, which would be students, parents, visitors, volunteers, members of the public, etc. So they're just fitting the new terms within the legislation within the school paradigm. So not only do schools have to abide by the Health and Safety at Work Act, they also fall under other acts as well that they have to abide by, so the Education Act and the Vulnerable Children's Act. So that's the frameworks that they are working under, but they also, and then the next layer down within the safety framework are those EOTC guidelines that we talked about before, and then from that they develop their safety systems for EOTC, or education outside the classroom. So that's the hierarchy from top down to bottom. Just a note on the Vulnerable Children Act 2014. So that specifies that anyone who works within the public sector with children needs to have a police check. So anyone who's employed by the public sector needs to have a police check to make sure there's no criminal record that could do harm to children. So even though schools are exempt from the adventure activity regulations, they still have legal responsibilities to keep staff and students safe. And just a quick note to define EOTC, education outside the classroom, really is exactly what it means. Anything that we're learning takes place outside of the classroom, and that can be within the school grounds, can be within the local environment, or it can be further afield, further within your region, further within New Zealand and overseas as well. So it really encompasses anything that literally outside the classroom. So the EOTC guidelines document 2016 is a key document that really gives guidance for schools on how to create safe operating procedures for schools for EOTC. Key document. So we spend a bit of time in class looking through just what's involved in this, and the layout, and what information is there. So spend some time, have a look at that and get familiar with the document. One of the key things that they talk about in the EOTC guidelines is that learning is a shared responsibility and encompasses all of basically anyone who's involved, all of these different roles have a responsibility for safety. And then that asks the question, who has ultimate responsibility for safety if it is shared? And the answer to that question is in the EOTC guidelines, which talks about ultimate responsibility for the safety of others, but belongs to the board of trustees, the principal, and the activity leader, or the person in charge, which may or may not be a teacher. So the planning for EOTC within the EOTC guidelines varies quite a bit, and it varies depending on the level of risk that the activity is involved in. And there's a couple of tables here that look at examples of off-site, on-site school activities outside the classroom and the levels of risk involved, and therefore what level of consent is required and risk management planning is involved. We then spend a bit of time looking at what competence levels and qualifications the teachers need for EOTC, and just have a look through the next couple of slides to answer that question. Now this section, again, straight out of the EOTC guidelines in terms of codes of practice and relevant standards, is really linking back to the good practice session that we looked at last time. So really it's just making those links that you're already aware of about what is good practice and where to find that good practice sources from. So again, just have another look through the next slides, read these different bits that are cut out of the EOTC guidelines. So currency is really important. So then we talked a little bit about how do you remain current, and there's lots of different ways of remaining current. If by going to workshops, looking at the EON's website, which runs some really good workshops there, professional development workshops, going to external conferences, symposiums, working with other providers who might be more experienced or higher qualified than the person running the activity, or than you are. having external qualifications which require have their own revalidation system. So there's a whole bunch of different ways, and I guess the key thing is just to make sure that you are current, especially when you've been in the job for a wee while. On the EON's website, we went to that as a class, and on one of the tabs called EOTC Management, and there is a frequently asked questions box there, and we just look through these questions here and report it back to the group about what was the key questions that people were asking. So there's some good information there. So this is relating back to the Health and Safety at Work Act again, and just in terms of penalties and prosecutions and how this relates to schools. So again, this next few slides, just some good information there to how it relates, how the Act, Health and Safety at Work Act, relates back to schools. So have a look through those. Waivers are an interesting one, and quite often people ask about if people have signed a waiver, a risk waiver, are they covered? Well, signed waivers don't release an organisation or anyone from their legal responsibilities for prevention of harm. So essentially a waiver of risk is kind of useless. You really want a risk acknowledgement form where whenever you're taking a student to do an activity that has risk involved, then there you need parental consent, and you need to explain the risks that are involved in that activity, and then so they're aware of what they're letting their students inform, their kids inform. There's a link here put out by WorkSafe and the Ministry of Education around what events do they need to, the schools have that need to be notified. So what serious harm events do schools need to notify WorkSafe about? So there's some quite good examples in there that give some guidance to schools around that. So again, this link won't work on the video, but if you have a look on Moodle, this link to this document is there. And another document that just fills in within a school context of potential offences and penalties for different levels within the school, so board of trustees, principal, staff and teachers, and other. Right, so just gives schools a bit of an idea there of if they don't comply with good practice, what can happen under the Health and Safety at Work Act for the different category of people involved within the school. A very short newspaper article here about a teacher in Waimate who was censored by the Teaching Council, so not prosecuted under the Act, but was still censored through another means. So have a quick read of that. Just again, different processes that can be enacted when good practice is not followed.